Have you ever wondered how a good person, someone kind, caring, full of empathy, can suddenly become something unrecognizable? How patience turns into harshness, how trust becomes suspicion, how love turns into coldness. It feels almost like a betrayal of their very nature. But what if I told you it is not sudden, it is not an overnight collapse. It is a slow, invisible process, one that unfolds so quietly that even the person themselves doesn't realize they are changing. Psychologist Philip Zimbardo called it the Lucifer effect, the moment when good people, placed under certain conditions, turn into something monstrous. He coined the term after his infamous Stanford prison experiment, where ordinary college students, young men with no history of cruelty, no criminal records, no intent to harm, turned into brutal guards in just a matter of days. No demons whispering in their ears, no sudden twist of fate, just the situation itself unlocking their darkest impulses. But the Lucifer effect is not confined to prisons, wars, or experiments. It unfolds in everyday life, at work, at school, in families, in relationships, and it always begins small. A good person says yes when their heart screams no. They swallow anger to keep the peace. They put others first, always, and sacrifice themselves in silence. And each time they do, a small piece of their inner balance erodes. They keep giving, 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 until one day there is nothing left inside but exhaustion and bitterness. Picture this. Someone who has spent their life seeking harmony suddenly realizes they've become a pawn. Colleagues dump extra work on them. Friends only call when they need something. Family members expect constant availability. At first they endure it with a smile. They nod, they agree, they show up. But inside, a different fire begins to burn, not the warm fire of love, but the dark fire of resentment, fueled by years of quiet suppression. And then it happens. The person everyone thought was the good one snaps. They raise their voice, they shut down, they pull away, they act in ways no one expected. Everyone around them asks, what happened? How could they change like this? But the truth is, they didn't suddenly change. The so-called monster had been growing inside them for years, built from every swallowed word, every fake smile, every forced yes. Zimbardo showed the world that power and roles can twist ordinary people into tyrants. But what many overlook is that the same forces can twist ordinary people into silent victims, and that victims too eventually reach a breaking point. Nietzsche once warned, "He who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster." But what happens when the monster is not outside of us, but inside, quietly growing in the cracks of our own self-denial? Here is the cruel reality. Good people don't turn into monsters because they are evil. They turn because they have betrayed themselves for too long, because they've choked back their truth until it poisoned them, because they've believed too strongly in the goodness of others, even when that belief destroyed them. Maybe you know this feeling, tired of being nice, tired of being available, tired of silencing your own needs just to keep everyone else comfortable. And somewhere deep inside, a voice whispers, "Enough." That voice is dangerous, not because it's wrong, but because if you ignore it for too long, it will become a scream. And when it becomes a scream, it no longer asks politely. It demands, it erupts. The Lucifer effect isn't some distant concept from a psychology textbook. It lives in you. In me, in every one of us. It shows that under the right conditions, each of us is capable of revealing our darkest side. And that's what makes it so terrifying. It sounds paradoxical, but it's true. The people most likely to fall into darkness are not the cold, the cynical, or the ruthless. It is the kind, the ones who listen, who forgive, who seek harmony at all costs. Why? Because their strength is also their weakness. Because they make the perfect targets for others' expectations, and they rarely defend themselves until it's too late. The good person wants peace. They avoid conflict. They'd rather say yes 100 times than disappoint someone once. They believe in the good in others even when it's proven wrong again and again. And this is exactly where the trap is set. Because those who don't draw boundaries will always be defined by someone else's. Those who don't enforce rules will end up living by the rules of those with fewer scruples. You may have felt it yourself. You give your time, your energy, your attention, and at first people seem grateful. They thank you, they admire you, they call you dependable. But soon, something shifts. Your giving becomes expected. Your help turns into a duty. And the one time you hesitate, the one time you need space, you're suddenly criticized, called selfish, labeled cold. Overnight, you're no longer the good one. You're the disappointment. That's the cruel twist. And most good people respond the same way. They give even more. Out of fear of rejection, out of fear of abandonment, out of fear that they are only worthy if they are endlessly useful. But every extra sacrifice feeds the monster within. Not the monster others fear, but the monster of suppressed rage. Each forced yes adds fuel to an invisible fire. Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment proved this dynamic. Those young men didn't become cruel guards because they were evil. They became cruel because they wanted to fulfill the role expected of them. They wanted to belong. They wanted to be good guards. That is the terrible irony. Evil is often born not from malice, but from obedience, from a desperate need to play the role the system assigns. The same is true in everyday life. The harmony seeker, the peacemaker, the endlessly patient friend, they don't realize they are storing dynamite beneath their calm surface. On the outside, they seem composed, reliable, even saintly. But inside, pressure builds, anger simmers, resentment grows. And when the eruption finally comes, it is all the more destructive because it has been years in the making. Why are good people so easy to manipulate? Because they've been taught from childhood to suppress their anger. They were told, be nice, be polite, don't cause trouble. They were rewarded for obedience, punished for resistance. And so they learned that their value comes from pleasing others, not from honoring themselves. This conditioning is dangerous. Someone who grows up believing their worth depends on how useful they are will always hesitate to draw lines. They will say yes when they should say no. They will swallow words they should have spoken. They will sacrifice their peace to maintain appearances, and little by little, they will lose touch with their own center. This is how the Lucifer effect creeps in. A good person trapped in this cycle becomes both victim and perpetrator. They hurt themselves first by denying their own truth. But eventually the suppressed rage spills outward and they hurt others too. Not because they chose malice, but because they were never allowed to choose themselves. And here lies the tragedy. When the explosion finally happens, when the mask cracks, when the good person lashes out or withdraws completely, nobody sees the years of sacrifice that led to that point. They only see the outburst. They condemn the monster, but never the system that created it. Maybe you recognize yourself here. Maybe you feel the exhaustion of always trying to do the right thing, the quiet resentment building inside when your kindness is taken for granted. If so, you understand the truth. Within every good person lies a hidden shadow, and the more they ignore it, the stronger it becomes. The Lucifer effect doesn't prey on the wicked, it preys on the kind. And that's why the good are always the ones who stand closest to the edge. When good people turn into monsters, it almost never happens by accident. There are systems, patterns, invisible strings pulling at them. Manipulation is not loud, it is not obvious, it is subtle, quiet, almost invisible. It seeps into daily life until you can no longer tell where your will ends and someone else's begins. So how does it work? Why do the kind and the gentle so often end up trapped? The answer lies in need. Good people crave connection. They long for belonging. They want to be useful, loved, accepted. And it's exactly this longing that makes them vulnerable. The first stage of manipulation is reward. A compliment here, a smile there. Praise for being so reliable, so generous, so selfless. At first it feels good, you feel valued. But soon, the reward becomes a leash. You start chasing it. You don't want to lose the approval, so you keep giving more. You sacrifice more. You adjust yourself again and again, just to stay in the glow of someone else's gratitude. Without realizing it, you've been conditioned. Your worth feels tied to how much you can provide. Then comes guilt, subtle at first. Someone sighs when you say no. Someone hints that you've changed, that you're not as supportive as you used to be. Or worse, they outright accuse you of being selfish. And because you've built your identity around being the good one, the accusation cuts deep. Guilt eats at you. You second-guess yourself even when you're right. You apologize, you explain, you overcompensate. Each time you give in, the net tightens. And finally, the last stage, control. By now, the people around you know exactly which buttons to press. A look of disappointment, a calculated silence, a hint of rejection. And you react instantly. You've become predictable, easy to steer, a puppet whose strings are not held by force, but by the fear of losing love. This is the dark brilliance of manipulation. It doesn't need violence. It doesn't need threats. It works with your own goodness. It uses your empathy against you. And while you think you're choosing freely, you're already dancing to a tune you didn't write. Zimbardo's Stanford experiment revealed how ordinary students, when handed roles, morphed into cruel guards. But what is often overlooked is that those guards were also victims of the system. They weren't just perpetrators, they were trapped in an expectation, compelled to act it out. The same thing happens outside the prison walls. When you're given the role of the helper, the fixer, the good one, you begin to live it until you forget who you actually are. But here's the cruelest part. On the outside, nothing looks wrong. You still smile, you still show up, you still help. People look at you and say, "See, they're fine." But inside, pressure builds, anger simmers, frustration grows into quiet rage, and the more it grows, the more it distorts you, until finally the mask slips, and what emerges shocks everyone, even you. That's why people say they changed overnight. But nothing about it is overnight. It's the product of years of slow erosion. Years of being reshaped by subtle guilt, subtle control, subtle expectations. And the society we live in reinforces this cycle. From childhood, we're trained to be good. Don't argue, don't resist, do what you're told. Obedience is rewarded. Rebellion is punished. And so we carry this conditioning into adulthood, into our jobs, our relationships, our friendships. We mistake compliance for kindness. We mistake self-erasure for virtue. But every sacrifice has a cost. Every time you betray yourself to please others, you feed the monster inside, and one day it will demand repayment. Sometimes through a violent outburst, sometimes through cold withdrawal, sometimes through a complete collapse of identity. This is the hidden cruelty of the Lucifer effect. It doesn't just show us how good people can commit acts of evil. It shows us how good people can be trained into roles that slowly devour them, until they no longer know where the mask ends and their true face begins. Before a good person becomes a monster, something strange happens. It is not the outburst, not the explosion, not the sudden act of rebellion that marks the turning point. It is silence, a cold, unfamiliar silence that unsettles everyone around them. It is the first sign that the soul is no longer willing to play the old game. Because silence is not always agreement. Sometimes silence is resistance. And when someone who has always been available suddenly goes quiet, everything shifts. Those who once relied on their endless compliance start to panic. The old tricks stop working. The buttons they used to push no longer trigger a response. The leash they held slips from their hands. And in that moment, the balance of power changes. Why is silence so dangerous? Because it breaks the script. As long as you react, defending, explaining, apologizing, you remain inside the story that others have written for you. You're predictable, you're manageable, you're controllable. But when you stop responding, you take the oxygen out of the system. The manipulator loses their grip. The cycle begins to collapse. For the one who chooses silence, the experience is not easy. At first, it feels unbearable, because silence means you can no longer prove to the world that you are the good one. It means people may misunderstand you, mislabel you, accuse you of being cold, selfish, arrogant. And for someone who has lived their entire life chasing approval, that feels like death. But it is in this death of the old self that something new begins to grow. Silence is not weakness, it is not cowardice. It is the awakening of a different kind of strength. A strength that no longer reacts but decides. A strength that no longer bends but stands. Zimbardo showed that situations can twist people into roles they never imagined. But what he touched only briefly is the reverse. The moment when people begin to withdraw from those roles. Silence is often the first step. It is like pulling the plug on a machine. Suddenly, the energy that once fed the system is gone. And without your reactions, without your compliance, the structure that exploited you begins to fall apart. Yet this silence does not come without consequences. Those who once controlled you will sense the shift. They will provoke you, accuse you, try to drag you back into the old script. They will say you've changed, that you've become selfish, that you've lost your way. Not because you've done anything wrong, but because you've stopped serving their needs. And this is where the danger lies, because silence can go two ways. If you embrace it consciously, it becomes power. It allows you to reclaim your energy, to set boundaries, to find clarity. But if you retreat into silence as a form of escape, it festers. Silence turns into bitterness, bitterness into resentment, and resentment, when left unchecked, explodes into rage. Nietzsche once wrote, "One must still have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star. But if the chaos is not guided, if the silence is not purposeful, the star never comes." Instead, the chaos gives birth to something darker, something destructive. That is the double-edged nature of silence. From the outside, everything looks calm. People may even think you're at peace. But inside, forces are gathering. Pressure is building. And the longer it builds, the more violent the eventual release will be. That is why when a good person finally erupts, it seems so sudden. But nothing about it is sudden. It is the result of years of swallowed words, unspoken truths, buried anger. Silence can be salvation, or it can be the prelude to catastrophe. The difference lies in whether it is chosen with awareness or forced through suppression. Chosen silence is sovereignty. Imposed silence is bondage. And the line between the two decides whether you will rise above the Lucifer effect or be consumed by it. When a good person finally turns into a monster, it doesn't happen because they were secretly evil all along. It happens because they stayed silent too long, gave too much, endured too much. Eventually, the structure inside them collapses, and what has been buried for years erupts with unstoppable force. It is the rebellion of the soul against its own suffocation. But rebellion is rarely gentle. It is raw, messy, and frightening. It comes out as rage, as cold detachment, as actions that no one ever expected. And this is when people around them say, they've changed. They're not the same anymore. But the truth is they haven't changed at all. They are finally showing the side of themselves that they denied for far too long. This is the tragedy of the Lucifer effect. Good people carry a hidden debt, not because they harmed others, but because they betrayed themselves. They ignored their limits, they silenced their voice, they sacrificed their truth. And sooner or later, that self-betrayal transforms into anger. Anger that no longer asks for permission, anger that no longer negotiates. That anger can destroy. It can burn bridges, tear families apart, shatter friendships. It can turn someone who was once a source of comfort into a source of fear. But anger can also do something else. It can liberate. It can be the fire that burns down false identities, so that something authentic can rise from the ashes. Zimbardo's work showed us that when you change the situation, you change the person. But he also reminded us, people can choose to step out of those situations. The Lucifer effect is not destiny. It is a warning. It is proof that darkness lives in everyone, but also that awareness can stop us from being consumed by it. The monster that emerges from a good person is not simply a demon of destruction. It is a signal. It is the body screaming, I cannot go on like this. It is the soul demanding boundaries, demanding honesty, demanding the right to exist without chains. If you listen to that signal, if you dare to face it, the monster becomes a teacher. It shows you where you abandoned yourself. It shows you where you gave too much. It shows you what must change. But this path is not easy. It requires the courage to be misunderstood, to be rejected, even to be hated. It requires the strength to lose people who only valued you for what you gave, not for who you were. It requires walking through loneliness, not the loneliness of emptiness, but the loneliness of rebirth. Nietzsche once said, "Become who you are." That is the essence of this transformation. To become who you are does not mean staying endlessly good in the eyes of others. It means facing your shadow, owning your anger, drawing your lines without apology. It means refusing to be endlessly available, endlessly pliable, endlessly controlled. It means finally choosing yourself. And maybe that's the hardest truth. Good people don't become monsters because they're bad. They become monsters because they never allowed themselves to be fully human. Because they denied their anger, their limits, their needs, until those things came back with a vengeance. The real task, then, is not to kill the monster, but to understand it. To recognize that it carries a message. You abandoned yourself for too long. And if you have the courage to hear that message, you can turn the monster into a guardian. You can transform rage into clarity. You can turn silence into sovereignty. You can stop being the victim of the Lucifer effect and become someone who has mastered it. That is the path to freedom, not being trapped by the mask of constant goodness, not being enslaved by other people's expectations, but standing in your own humanity, light and shadow alike. Because true strength is not in being endlessly good. True strength is in being whole.